Hi, welcome to our listeners and viewers who've been following us on this whole series of shorts. Shorts, as you know, are conversations, very crisp conversations, really, with global leaders, mostly with global HR leaders. I have with me a very special guest today, and an old friend actually, Sameer Nagarajan, Sam as he's called, and he's the global HR president for Cadila Pharmaceuticals, based out of Ahmedabad. And he's had long, deep experience. And just before I, start off the conversation, I think one of the things I like about Sam is one is that he's very practical in a way, but also very thoughtfully practical, if I may call it that. So, Sam, welcome to this conversation.
Hi, Bimal. Thanks a lot. Yes, I think it's been a long time since we've been face to face, and it's great to connect up for a conversation.
Great. So, Sam, and your experience with Unilever, and then subsequently with other companies, and now, if I were to say that, what have been your 2 or 3 key learnings around leadership in general? That what does leadership mean to you? What does it look like? Give us a sense of that.
I think when I look back on my career, I think after the first 10 years, I would say, or maybe the first 13 years of my career, I was either doing jobs that didn't exist before I did them, or I was completely reinventing the roles. And that was something that I realized early on excited me. I really enjoyed it. Gave me a lot of opportunities to experiment, to do what I wanted to do, to learn, to fail at times, to succeed at times, get acknowledged, but learn a lot around what really worked for me. In fact, when I did not do that, when I was trying to maintain, when I was getting into what I would call a maintenance mode role or an admin mode role, in fact, I was not as successful, frankly. And so that was the first thing I learned, the first of 3 or 4 learnings I had, which is that you need to know what drives you. You need to know what you're passionate about. As you know from my career, Bimal, at a fairly late stage in my career, about 20 years into my career, I went into industrial relations.
Right.
The head of industrial relations for Hindustan Unilever. And I think at a time when the classical MBA model is that you start your career in IR, spend 2 or 3 years, 4 years, whatever, and then go into HR.
Right.
For me, the insight was if you can release so much energy by managing 1,500 or 2,000 people with your HR, classical HR kind of role, then how much more energy could you liberate if you manage 10,000 or 11,000 people the same way? And therefore, and that's what drove me to it. Second learning, therefore, don't be constrained by what people expect of you or the rules that other people set or the expectations that other people have. It doesn't matter. I think follow your own path, do your own thing, and really chase it till the end. The third thing I learned, and in fact, I was chatting up with a friend a couple of days back, and we were looking back at all the steps that I took in my career, and there were at least 3 distinct occasions where we were able to map out that I took a step backwards, and it helped to move a step forward. So, for instance, when I spent the first 3 years of my career in manufacturing and IT, and then went into consulting, stepped back actually, went back into levers again, or rather went into levers, not back into levers, and then had a couple of stints after that, which, if I look back, as in all such cases, you find stints that are not so successful, but it's not always an easy learning path, and you look back and say, oh, that was wonderful, and I learned something, and let's move on from that. You actually have to reckon the consequences at some point in time, and that's why we, both of us looked back on it and we felt that it actually taken a step backwards. But I think the important thing was, what do you learn from it? What do you learn from your experiences, and how do you build that into your repertoire? How do you make that a new capability, new ability, build it into your repertoire going forward? I can't also overemphasize the importance, I think, of what are considered the basics of leadership, but I think what is expected of everyone. You have to be trustworthy. You have to be a person of integrity. I think people expect you to show vulnerability, to show your human side, but not so vulnerable that they start doubting your ability to find solutions. It's always a very delicate balancing act. And those, as of now, have been the 3 or 4 big things that have with me that I keep reflecting on in terms of the leadership journey.
The second point you talked about, not being very, if I may put it in different words, not being overly worried about what other people think or what other people advise, and look at unconventional career paths in a way, kind of a thing, because that's what you want to do in a way, and you can learn from it, and you see that as a good thing to do. Uh, Related to that is also this whole aspect of, and I'm using a big word called courage, right? And I think most people actually struggle with that. So if you have to, and not just necessarily from a courage in a career point of view, but courage in general for leadership, how do you see that? If I were to see, and have you had any, examples? I'm sure you have a lot of examples, but is there something you can quote to us which would tell us how you think about courage a little bit differently?
I think that's a wonderful question. I think, I don't think of myself as very courageous. And I don't know, I know people use the word in describing someone else, but I think it's in the moment. I can think of a lot of words that describe how I feel in particular moments. Courage is not one of them. It's like, I want to do this. I like this. And I think somewhere there is the conflict between you want to be liked, you want to be popular, but you want to do your own thing. You want to make an impact, but you want to make an impact nicely. These are all what I call the paradoxes of leadership. Right. Everyone must like you, but they must like you for what you are, and people must naturally see the goodness of what you do or the benefits of what you do. It doesn't happen. Right. Frankly, I think there are times and times when I've had to dig in my heels and take a deep breath and say, no, this is how it's going to happen, or this is what I think, and this is why I think this way. One of my most successful stints, which I will not name, it took me a full 18 months, almost 15 to 18 months to rally around, get all the stakeholders around to my side. And even now, I can't say all of them got around to my side. I think some of them just retired. So I think it was, so to come back to your question, is it courage? I think you need to want something badly enough to push a stake into the ground and say, yes, this is where I stand and this is what is important to me. Yeah. And that involves challenging all your assumptions and all your beliefs. I mean, so are you going to tell your boss that no, you don't agree with him or her on what their pet project is or what their pet assumptions are? I've been lucky in some jobs, most jobs, I would say. I've had bosses who've been very supportive, but support does not mean that they're going to fight your battles for you. I think your stakeholders will still expect you to stand up and be counted and say what is important and what is relevant. And I think finding that courage, some of it comes from experience, some of it comes from belief, some of it comes from what I call integrity, but not in the classical sense of, or not in the textbookish sense of being honest, or but saying what you do and doing what you say. Right. Again, an oft-repeated kind of quote. It's not as if it's not binary, it's not as if you're there or not there. You are somewhere on that continuum and you're trying to get better or get closer to the end that you want to be on every day. And I think the process of discovering yourself that makes other people feel that you have courage. Right. Or whatever label they want to put on it. At some points in time, it's the same. Some people say courage. At other points in time, I was people coming to me and saying, boss, I'm not totally convinced, but since you're saying it, we'll do it. That's how also sometimes how it's perceived, or sometimes are you courageous or are you foolhardy? I don't know. It's a very thin dividing line until you know the outcomes. You don't know which one it is. In retrospect, yes, it looks like you've been courageous more times than you've been foolhardy, and that's what has worked. But that's my take on it. I think it's a pretty nasty feeling in that moment when you realize that a lot of people are looking at you, a lot of people in positions of authority, or a lot of people whose views you respect, or you carry that belief, that unconscious belief that they should like you or that they should support you, and you realize what you're going to get up and say is not something that they'd like to hear, or you're not sure that they would like to hear it or they would like it. And what do you do in that situation? Is the question.
That's a very nice way of putting it. So let me take a different aspect of leadership, Sam. So you mentioned two words, and one is this word paradox, and the other is around balance, right? And like we know this well enough that leaders have to do that balancing act between various different variables, and obviously there are paradoxes in many things we do, kind of thing. But if you were to look at your career, plus also the fact that you worked with many leaders across sectors, etc., what would be two, three things you'd say people go through? So when I have to decide and I say I am stuck with something where I need to balance multiple things, or I understand that it's a paradox intellectually, but now I need to make a decision and move on. What would be those three, four things you would consider before you sort of in a way make a choice?
Very interesting question. I've never thought of it that way, but never followed such a conscious decision-making process. To me, it often comes a little intuitively, a little spontaneously at times. One is I would try and step back and look at the larger picture.
Mm-hmm.
Does it serve a larger purpose? Does it serve the larger good? So it's like that example I was telling you. If you can use the same principles that you use for 1,000 people, if you can use for 10,000 people, how much energy would you liberate? Is it the right thing to do? I mean, it's a little difficult to explain that, but let me try. When I say the right thing to do, one is not a purely rational construct of does it add up towards the end point. Sure, I would like it to add up to the end point, but sometimes you do need to move a little sideways or take a step back, as I said, in a different context. But is it so when I say right, is it fair? Is it equitable? Is it sensitive to the realities of the persons and the situation? And how am I actually dealing with the paradox? Which side of the paradox am I landing on, and why? So it's like, let's take this paradox of reward. You always say that it's a fondly held management notion, and I think we in HR also propagate it quite strongly. So that if you perform well, you should be rewarded disproportionately. The paradox is, of course, that you need both the strong high performer as well as the what we call the the core, the solid core, or the solid middle management team. So how are you going to explain this when someone comes to you and says that sure, I've not been an outstanding exceptional performer. In fact, people who take extreme positions are easier to deal with. It's a realistic person who's very difficult to explain to. It says, I'm not an outstanding performer. I'm not great, but badly either. So what explains this differential? I don't agree with the differential. I don't agree. I agree with the rating. I agree with the process and all that. But that you have got a 12% increment and I've got a 6% increment is very unfair to me. How do you so how do you explain that? How do you answer a question of that sort becomes a huge challenge in my mind. And then there's these organizational blind spots which sometimes I've been blessed or cursed with the ability to see. And I've often had this fight saying, this is a blind spot. You can't seriously be saying this. You can't seriously be doing this. One of the organizations I know looks at, or one of the organizations that I worked for, looks at people who've joined fresh out of college and stayed with the company in a very different way from how it looks at lateral hires. And to that, it's a slight organizational blind spot there, in terms of perceptions about abilities and growth and so on. So, no, that's not right. And you can't do something like that. So, are you able to challenge your way through? Are you able to argue your way through? And another important thing for me is how core is this? Which of my values is this touching, and how core is that value? If it's something peripheral, if it's touching on a belief, and if it's not, I can live with it. I might say, okay, this is a battle I'll fight, but beyond a point, I won't fight it. But if it's something very, very core, central to, say, if some of my values are around fairness, equity, transparency, communication, and so on, if it touches on one of those values, then I would fight full scale for it. Paradoxes be damned after that. My own view is what will prevail. So those are some of the things I would look at least. I would also, I guess, I've also been lucky to have good mentors, I think, from a fairly early stage in my career, people whom I look up to, people whom I respect, and over a period of time, we've kind of stabilized into a mentor-mentee role, and I'm still in touch with them. So they offer me a lot of perspective at times in terms of what to do, what not to do. So all that is useful.
Great. So, Sam, let me pick on something else you said, right, and maybe relate it a little bit more to, the recent times. But before I go there, what you said is very practical, because one of the things you said is about, how hard do you want it, or how much do you want something will often decide which way you go, and kind of that touching upon your values, and is it a core value or a peripheral value kind of thing. And I think in many ways, I also related to the first point you talked about, which is about self-awareness and becoming clear about what is that you want. And I think for most leaders, and many research and everything else is still talking about that, but I'm not sure how to crack the problem. So let me, and I think it's a journey, as you rightly pointed out, right? But that's been my experience, at least. But let me come back to a different aspect, right? And you talked about repertoire. So do you think that leaders need to build something more than, what we've, talked about for many years now? In the last year and a half, given that it's like a once a century kind of a occurrence of the pandemic and so on and so forth, do you think, are there one or two very specific things which leaders need to focus on beyond what is, what we would always talk about, and some of the things you talked about as well?
Yeah, I think you're right. The last 18 months or so have been completely turned all our assumptions about management and leading people and working with people upside down. I think the first is to recognize that the fundamental building blocks have changed. And no matter how much we talk about back to work or back to normalcy or back to old times, it's never going to be the old normal again. For a variety of reasons, including the behavioral part of it, but also I think fundamentally the economic model has changed. I think if you can reduce office space in a city like Mumbai by half, you are going to save crores per month.
Correct.
And that's crores coming back into the business. And that's just one example. I think there are other economic reasons why a lot of companies are realizing that this is not a bad place to be in from an economic point of view, but behaviorally very, very different. I think there are 3 or 4 key challenges that I see for leaders, and especially in our kind of context and narrative. I think the first thing is that recognizing that it's completely different, completely unusual, and you're leading a team. How good are you at exploring the unknown? How well can you explore the terrain? That old thing, the map is not the terrain. So you might have a map of what you do, but unless you do it, you're not really going to reach anywhere at all. And that's going to call for a whole lot of skills to come into question. Your comfort with ambiguity, your ability to deal with uncertain situations, which seem to twist and turn every few minutes or every few hours, and you don't know which way it's going to go. In that process, can you manage your own feelings well? I think I hear a lot about anxiety, about sorrow, about at this time, I think the pandemic has hit home to all of us in some way or the other, and everyone knows someone who's dead.
Yeah.
So there is a lot of grief, a lot of sorrow, a lot of anxiety that is personal, anger as well, and then there is the emotions of your team.
Right.
How do you deal with that? Now, the third is around the ways of working in the team itself. So while working from home sounds very exciting, the fact is that processes like induction, culturalization, communication, they rely a lot on face-to-face interaction. Right. Ultimately, a lot of it is around, or a lot of it in the past has been around having a cup of coffee with someone and saying, what does the CFO think of the CEO? Can you tell me a little bit more about that? You can't do that on a Zoom call. It's very, very difficult. I think you know what I mean in terms of the soft conversations and the gossipy conversations that go on in an organization. And related to all this, I think it's terrifically important, much more important than it's always been in terms of how do you get feedback? How open are you to feedback? How receptive are you? How do you deal with it? How do you make it apparent and evident that you are open and that you can take the feedback that you get as a leader and work with it to improve yourself? And those are, I think, some of the facets of leadership that are coming far more into play now. And it's going to get intensified as it goes forward. Adding on to some of the points that you also mentioned, like courage or or that we mentioned, courage and integrity and the ability to move forward, lead a team, and so on.
Right. Yeah, I'm Sam. Before I go to the last couple of questions, I think a couple of things. With the companies and leaders, at least I personally work with, I think I'm seeing maybe a couple of other aspects which are, coming up more and more. One is that there is this, I would say, challenge for leaders, and I'll break that into two parts, right? So one is to do with the fact that what you took into consideration when you were making decisions, the variables have actually changed. And I'm going back to that whole decision making point that, fundamentally what you need to consider today is not, of course, at a very high level, it still seems the same time. How do you serve the customer? What are the cost issues? How do you do all of that stuff? But at a very granular level, I think the nature of things have changed at a very fundamental level. For example, I just came across one CEO, for example. He's now, looking at saying, okay, I'm okay to hire a candidate in Barcelona because he or she is going to actually cost me the same in Bombay. But I am not sure how do I actually, firstly, bring them in? How do I make them productive? And how do I make sure that they trust the organization enough to stay along for the next 3 or 4 years? Because this role requires, so that whole aspect of, how do you manage an organization, which is one of the big CEO challenges, I guess, those decision-making parameters are going to change quite dramatically. That's what it looks like. The second aspect is that, and which is, I think, going to impact a lot of organizations. I think consumer behavior will fundamentally shift. Okay.
Yeah.
And that is an aspect which I think many companies have traditionally taken for granted in many different ways. So that whole element of what are people now going to value, why would they buy a product of company A versus company B, I think is going to require a very different kind of thinking from CEOs and marketers as well, I guess. And I think those are two things I'm seeing a lot of conversations starting to come up. And I think CEOs again intellectually understand it, but dealing with it is a completely different ballgame. So I think, yeah, those are. I just want to add those couple of things to what you said earlier.
They're terrific examples, both of them. And I'm just thinking about the first one, about the CEO who told you that he's open to hiring someone from Barcelona because cost-wise, Barcelona and Mumbai are not very different. And that triggered off a completely different set of thoughts in my mind, related, but different in the sense of, it calls, how sensitive are we to cultural differences? How sensitive are we to, have we identified the assumptions that we've made about ourselves and about other people in the world? What are our beliefs like? What are our limiting beliefs like? I worked with an organization that believed that it had all the answers and was very happy to export its version of the answers to the rest of the world. But when they realized that the rest of the world has a view of its own, at times, it became a very, 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 very different kind of discussion altogether.
Yeah.
And I think this is creative friction. This is creative tension. If it's channelized correctly, to be able to say that can I work with people from another country who will come bring in their own frame? So it's not just about the assumptions of this organization or the culture of this organization. It's about the culture of their country and my country. And there will be differences. There's no way that everything will be perfectly aligned in that sense. And how do you deal with them? How do you build capability and resilience to grow forward and integrate? And if you do integrate, then you have pretty much a good thing going, especially if you've got, if you're also simultaneously dealing with a consumer base that is international.
Correct.
Then you have probably the opportunity to understand your consumers much more closely from interactions with people much more closely. And then, I mean, some of the things I'm thinking of are gender, communication, attitudes around time, diversity, inclusion, power distance.
Yeah.
If you're going to compare a Europe with an India, that's one issue that would kind of figure very close, very heavily. Issues around or perceptions around authority and power and hierarchy and so on would just, and that's just kind of beginning to scratch the top of the iceberg and actually get much deeper into it. So I was reflecting a minute on.
No, I think that's great. And also the fact that, Sam, you worked in multiple locations, held international jobs, worked with so many multinationals. I think the only comment I would make before I go forward is that for you it may still come a little bit easier because you've actually had experience of working in multiple countries, worked with I don't know how many countries you've dealt with as in your international roles. Maybe 30 or 40 or something like that, I would guess at the minimum.
Yeah.
But it doesn't come easily to many leaders who've been very domestic in their outlook. So it's not an easy one to crack, if I may say so, right? So
I think you're right. I mean, I've 30 to 40 would be a good estimate of the number of countries I've worked with or managed in the aggregate over a period of time. I think openness to new experiences, the ability to, I think it helps that I'm very fond of traveling. I think it helps that I don't have too many issues talking to strangers in a reasonably kind of setting. Openness to feedback, I think all that counts, and it helps you broaden the mind. And once your mind kind of opens up, it never contracts. But
that's a good way of putting it.
I think, sorry.
I said it's a very good way of putting it, actually.
Yeah, but you're right. I think I see a lot of new leaders struggling with this issue because they come in with a particular set of assumptions of what's worked for me in that organization, in that context. So why should it be different anywhere else? And to get across the message that this is different, what worked for you there, some elements of it may work for you here, but on the whole, some of your assumptions about the world are going to change.
Right.
I'll just share one anecdote. I think the first time I moved abroad 10 years back, at the end of the first year, I was having a discussion with my boss and he said, how's it been? So I was like, lots of learning, new country, new people, new role, this is different, that is different. And I raised it with him myself. I said, if I was to talk in terms of output, however, in terms of deliverables, that's been just about average. I mean, I don't think you would rate me very highly. And I was lucky the boss was a very sympathetic man or a very empathetic man and very compassionate. So he just smiled and said, welcome, international roles are always like this. So now at least you've got the context right. Now you need to figure out how to get work done through people in this kind of a context. And so we started working together on that. But yeah, it's a challenge. And I was coming in from a very successful place earlier than that in terms of, huge amounts of delivery, breaking the mold, breaking all assumptions, stereotypes. So for me also, it was a very humbling kind of experience. So come from that kind of a skyrocketing this thing into a place where you look back at the end of 12 months and say, gosh, what did I really deliver at the end of it? But once you look at that in the face and you get the feedback like, okay, now I know what I need to focus on and how to get moving from here. But yeah.
No, that's a great example, Sam. And I know we can keep talking about this aspect, and I'm sure you've got lots of stories to share with us. But I'm going to ask you one last question before we close. And it's a personal question, and I'm sure our in fact one of our regular shorts viewers actually sent us that asked this question. So I'm asking this of many leaders. So if I were to ask you as a leader, forget about being HR or whatever your roles are. What are the one or two things which you have set out for yourself to learn, let's say in the next 12 to 18 months, and saying, this is something I need to learn as an individual in my journey, kind of a thing. What would that one or two things, whatever it is?
I think one or two things I've set out to learn for myself personally in the journey forward. Yeah. Well, I think there are two things that I would call out there. I think from a professional point of view, I think understanding this whole piece around how I deal with ambiguity, how I deal with a lack of structure, and how I create structure. What we are doing in Cadila is creating an exciting HR function. We have a very clear vision of what we would like the organization and the function to be like. But how do we translate, how do we flesh out that vision and translate it into something that's practical on the ground and implemented on the ground? And we have our own expectations in terms of what impact we create. We have milestones in terms of what impact we create and what kind of time frame we do it in. So one part of it is the hard space around that in terms of the execution and conceptual skills required to frame that out and deliver it. But I think related to that is the second expectation, which is also related for me. I do a lot of process work. So in terms of my own intrapersonal work, in terms of my own mindsets, my own beliefs, my own assumptions and values, and in terms of how I deal with the group process. Because we do have a group around us, and all organizations have groups in that sense. And obviously people bring all of themselves to work. Now we want to encourage that to happen, but we also want to channelize that into a particular direction. And I think there's an exciting opportunity there in terms of making the work more meaningful and more productive and more enjoyable at the end of the day for everyone in the organizations. That's really what we would be focusing on. And yeah, I mean, you started off this discussion, or just before this discussion, you said that I'm the quintessential corporate man. So you should have expected something about the corporate to come into all this.
Thanks, Sam. This has been a lovely conversation, and I'm sure our listeners and viewers would thoroughly sort of enjoy it. So, Sam, thank you very much. And, I'm sure we'll continue this discussion in other forums and formats as we go along. So, great to have you again as a guest on this show. Yeah.
Thank you, Bimal. It's been great chatting up with you, and I think it's been a very refreshing and interesting discussion for me as well. Thank you for the opportunity, and yes, of course, let's continue to remain in touch.